Actually, I was the first time in Ljubljani. I was in 1997, I think. So it's now more than a quarter century that I know this place. I always like to come back because I really like this city. To speak about Heidegger reception is actually can be a very short lecture, because maybe you heard that the German economy is in recession. We have a recession in Germany, so economic recession, and the same counts for Heidegger research. It's also a recession. So of course there's no connection between, but I can just try to explain the situation or the problem a little bit, because this problem has, of course, something to do with, on the one side, the academic situation and the academic reception of Heidegger, also the academic research, and there are certain generations of academics, of researchers, and well, the political situation. Of course, this is, I guess, the most important thing to see a certain to understand the relation between the academic tradition in Germany and the political discussions in Germany. I guess this is the main problem concerning Heidegger reception, Heidegger research. Just to say that you know that, of course, the engagement of Heidegger in National Socialism, his rectorate in Freiburg, and then the Heidegger reception after the war. It's actually interesting to look or to ask yourself whether there was a National Socialist reception of Heidegger philosophy. That is actually not quite uninteresting, because there actually was no really strong reception of his philosophy in the Third Reich. Of course there's this engagement, but it's not that we could say that Heidegger was a central thinker of the Third Reich. There are some reviews of whatever being in time. There are some remarks in certain books, references to Heidegger, but it was not the case that Heidegger was an important philosopher for the Third Reich. I would, for instance, dare to say that Kant was a more important philosopher for the Third Reich than Heidegger. And I have arguments for that, because you can really show that Kant was very, very important for the academic situation of philosophy in the Third Reich. But nevertheless, after the war, Heidegger was he could not teach anymore. His Venia Legeni was withdrawn at the beginning, but in the 50s, also through France and Paris, through his influence, Heidegger became more and more important also again in Germany, and that's because of certain key figures in the academic situation. Of course, Heidegger was still reading then in Freiburg, but it's, for instance, very important to see that there was Hans-Georg Gadamer as his student, who got very influential in the German academic situation. He was a Heidegger, not only a Heidegger student, but he was also somebody who fostered Heidegger's philosophy, who was interested in Heidegger, and he was a Heideggerian in this way. So it was very important to see how, or it could be very important to see how Gadamer acted in the 50s and the 60s. I guess in 1 year or something we will have the correspondence between Gadamer and Heidegger. It's not published now, but it will be a very important important document to understand the situation of German philosophy after the war, because Heidegger used, of course, Gadamer also for certain academic decisions concerning chairs and so on, concerning jobs at universities with certain, and to give these jobs to certain persons. So we have Gadamer, but then the next generation we have certain researchers who studied with Heidegger and who became very famous in the 70s and also in the 80s. Actually, when I began to study, they were still, how could you say that? They were still in charge. They were still teaching. Like, for instance, Otto Pöggeler or Walter Biemel, or my teacher Klaus Held. Maybe, of course, not to forget Friedrich Wilhelm von Hermann in Freiburg. Eugen Fink was also still teaching. Von Hermann was an assistant of Fink, and then the so-called last private assistant of Heidegger. So this was very important to see that there was a kind of a certain network of these Heidegger researchers and Heidegger students in a way. Also, for instance, take Günter Fiegert, the president of the Heidegger Society, and so on. He was a student of Gadamer. So you have certain generations of professors, researchers who were in the 70s and in the 80s quite influential in the German institution of the university. So in this time, Heidegger research was, I guess, in a way on its peak. You have to understand that, of course, always referring to the French, to the influence of the French situation of Derrida, the deconstruction. So that came to Germany, and all these deconstructionists are talking of Heidegger as their main influence. So in this sense, when I began to study in the 80s, yeah, well, you could learn Heidegger, you could study Heidegger everywhere in a way. All the phenomenologists, all the hermeneutics, or all the chair for hermeneutics were dealing with Heideggerian philosophy. Then, I guess it's very important also to understand the reception of Heidegger, the inauguration of the Gesamtausgabe at the beginning of the 70s, or, well, the first volume, I guess, came out in 75. The Gesamtausgabe was right up from the beginning one could say a problematic one, because it's called in German Heidegger Ausgabe letzter Hand. You can translate that as edition last of the last hand. That it means that the paradigm for this kind of edition was actually the Gesamtausgabe, the collected works of Goethe. Goethe, the first collected works of Goethe, where Goethe he himself gave the structure for these editions, Goethe. So that means that the last hand of the Goethe manuscripts, this last hand was the hand of Goethe himself, and so it should have been also with Heidegger, who died in 76, that Heidegger organized his own Nachlass, his own manuscripts, and that the editors only have to realize the organization, the structure of these manuscripts Heidegger gave by himself. So this was definitely not a historical critical edition. like for instance the Husserl edition. And this method, of course, to edit books on the basis of historical critical method is actually until now the most important and the actual way to edit manuscripts of philosophy. So right up from the beginning there was this critique for the Gesamtausgabe because everybody thought actually, and in a way one can say that there were problems, that the family and von Hermann had a privileged access to the material, a privileged access to the manuscripts, and that actually the public sphere didn't know what they actually were doing with the manuscripts of Heidegger. Well, nevertheless, until now we have probably, I don't know, 99 volumes of 102. I guess the Gesamtausgabe will have at the end 103 or 104 volumes, and the speed of the publication of the books was very high. So actually, you can say that in 50 years, the whole edition was published. That means 2 volumes per year, and this speed you cannot have in an edition when you make a historical critical edition. That's impossible. Probably you would have 10 volumes until now, and not 100. So in this sense, there was always a kind of suspicion concerning this Gesamtausgabe, and in a way, maybe in the context of the Black Notebooks, suddenly there were certain problems concerning certain remarks in the Black Notebooks, but not only in the Black Notebooks, also in other manuscripts. So in this sense, in the realm of the academics, there were people very critical against the Gesamtausgabe, and also very critical against the people who were organizing the Gesamtausgabe. That means Freiburg, and Freiburg was of course very important in the Heidegger reception of the last 50, 40 years, because of course there was also a von Hermann school in a certain way, who was received as highly dogmatic and orthodox. And this was, that was, of course, also in the atmosphere of the Bundesrepublik Deutschland, where, for instance, critical theory was very, very important. The influence of Adorno was important. The influence of the critics of Adorno and Heidegger were very important. So it was a complicated situation in a way, because if you were a Heidegger critic, you could say that there is a Heidegger school, that there is a Heidegger dogmatic. There are people who are taking care of Heidegger, and Heidegger was not in this sense a figure of a public discussion, of a public discourse, because there was a kind of, one could even say maybe a certain esoteric group who were dealing with his thinking. But nevertheless, because Heidegger had these kind of key figures like Gadamer, the presence of Heidegger at the universities was very, very strong. Also by the influence of like I said, of the French philosophy in this time. There are some other receptions of Heidegger quite interesting, a little bit out of sight. For instance, in the realm of media theory in Germany, there were media philosophers or media theorists who were very free, very liberal in their Heidegger reception. Like, for instance, Friedrich Kittler is a very important figure in media theory in Germany, or for instance, Dieter Mersch, who's still living and teaching in Zurich. This is an interesting aspect of Heidegger reception, because this kind of dealing with Heidegger was very undogmatic, like I said, very free, and they for these media theorists, for instance, the aspect of Heidegger's philosophy of technology was very, very important. So this also exists in this context. But now there were, like I said before, there was always this tension between the public sphere and the academic sphere. Then we have two. I would say there are two very important impacts in the German history of Heidegger research. The first was probably '89, the publication of Faria's book about Heidegger and National Socialism, where Habermas wrote an introduction to this book, and this book had at least in the public sphere, a huge impact. The academics were skeptical because Farias was actually also a student of Heidegger, and he was not very satisfied of Heidegger, of him as his professor. So in a way, this book had always a little bit the taste of a kind of revenge. But nevertheless, in the public sphere, and also because of the influence of Habermas as the successor of Adorno, in the public sphere, this book had a huge importance. So the academics began to, the Heidegger critics, how to say, they became a certain, more and more they became a certain institutional background to, for instance, then think about, for instance, about Heidegger research at their institutes. Then something happened. What probably always happens in the history of institutions. All these people I mentioned, like Biemel, Pögler, von Hermann, Held, they retired and disappeared from the context of academic and institutional Heidegger research. And because of this political discussions about Farias, and then in 2014 about the publication of the first Black Notebooks, I guess that more and more the institutions decided not to give these chairs of who are connected with Heidegger research to Heidegger researchers anymore, because of the public, the public opinion against Heidegger. So after, one could say that in the public sphere, after the struggle of critical theory of Adorno and Habermas, today in the public sphere, Heidegger is, in Germany, Heidegger is just seen as the Nazi, one could say that. And the institutions, were not, how can I say that, independent enough to not to confirm this general academic, this general public opinion against Heidegger. So in this sense, we have, I would say, it's kind of a crisis of Heidegger research in Germany. I wouldn't say that there is. I wouldn't say that there is a place today where you definitely could study Heidegger. For instance, in the context of the discussion of the Black Notebooks, you know that maybe that Figal, who was a very important Heideggerian in Freiburg, he had the chair of so-called Husserl Heidegger chair, or whatever, in Freiburg. He renounced his position in the Heidegger Society. He retired from that, and he openly, publicly declared that he would never deal with Heidegger again. So that was, for instance, one of the academic also. Yeah, it's nonsense. Of course, it's nonsense. But he did that. So so this is, for instance, this was one of the academic events after the publication of the Black Notebooks, that even in Freiburg today, you actually cannot anymore study Heidegger in this sense. So I would say what we would, for the future, what we would need is a critique of Heidegger reception in Germany. It doesn't exist. There are for instance, books on Heidegger reception in France, for instance, from Dominique Janicot, a very Heidegger en France, very important book concerning the Heidegger reception in France. And there are books about Heidegger reception in the United States, but there is no critical access or no critical study of the Heidegger reception in, for instance, whatever, even in the Third Reich, but in the Bundesrepublik Deutschland. So what we would need would be a critical research on this field, and after that, maybe a new start with Heidegger research. A new start with Heidegger research, not in the alternative between how could you say that? Between permanent Heidegger critique, yeah, because that we have many professors in the academic situation who are criticizing Heidegger permanently, and on the other side, Heidegger orthodoxy and Heidegger dogmatics, who are just apologizing Heidegger all the time. We had this situation in the last 30-40 years in Germany, and I guess this has to stop, because this is not fruitful for Heidegger research and for Heidegger studies. So we would have to find a way in between, and we would have to find a way just to read Heidegger as a serious and important philosopher, who was probably one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century, if not the most important philosopher of the 20th century. And in this sense, to stop with this polemics and to begin anew with a new kind of reading and a new kind of dealing with this philosopher. With all the problems that there are in this philosophy, of course there are problems in this philosophy, but we have to see that these problems are not, for me at least, not strong enough to exclude Heidegger from the academic field or something like that. That's totally nonsense, of course. So in this sense, after a certain, like I said before, critique of Heidegger reception, I guess there could be a new start for Heidegger research in Germany, and I would argue for that. Whether this is possible, I don't know, but I hope so. That will be possible. So this was my small.
Über deinen Beitrag.
Mein Beitrag.
Weiter.
My contribution.
nach der Erscheinung deines Buches Heidegger.
Yeah, well, I am the editor of the Black Notebooks, and I was actually I discovered these. I read these passages. Probably after the family. I was the first one who read the Black Notebooks, the manuscripts, and yeah, that's an own story. Of course, very even, well, in a way hurtful. Because, yeah, I was then I was confronted with the conservative dogmatic part of the of Heidegger research, not only in Germany, but also coming from France. François Félier, he was the main person and translator of Heidegger in Paris and in France for the last 30-40 years. He was also a friend of von Hermann. And I worked, of course, with von Hermann for decades, and very, very good actually. We had a good relation, and I was not against von Hermann as a person. He was a very nice man. I'm very. You can really good. I learned from him even, but when it came to the question how to publish the Black Notebooks, or to publish them or not, and whatever to do with these notebooks, we disagreed totally, and And this belongs also to the story of Heidegger reception. This was in a certain way, of course, a rupture in Heidegger, in the history of the Gesamtausgabe at least, but also maybe in Heidegger research in Europe, because well, there were publications like, for instance, this book about the truth of the Black Notebooks with Alfieri, where von Hermann spoke of my marriage, that I'm not a good person, and so on. So that he tried to argue ad hominem to explain the public sphere that this man who is the editor of the Black Notebooks, that he is not a good person, that he is bad, and so on. So these kind of things began with this publication of the Black Notebooks, and a certain book of mine where I was dealing with these passages about the Jews, which I read as, in a certain way, anti-Semitic. In a certain way, it's not important to explain my interpretation of this anti-Semitism, but I interpret it as a certain kind of anti-Semitism. And what for me was not really a problem, but what actually was more a problem for them than for me, because for them they took it very personally. For them it was absolutely impossible that Heidegger could have been in a certain way an anti-Semite, or that he was whatever linked, connected with a certain worldview, maybe, who was close to, or who was national socialist in a way. But these were interesting years and interesting discussions. The one part of the story is also that actually these manuscripts were leaked. There was a leak, and the discussion began in Paris. And there was an article in the Nouvelle Observateur. One day, I got a call, and somebody said, "Do you know that there is a huge discussion about Heidegger's anti-Semitism in Paris?" And there was nothing was actually published. And everybody thought that actually I also one part of the story, that I placed the discussion by sending material to the Nouvelle Observateur, and I think that this actually is really a great idea. It was I would have been a genius in dealing with the public sphere. You know, how could this is really something what you think. If you think that if you want to start a discussion of Heidegger, then of course you go to Paris. It would have been the best thing to do, but it wasn't me. So all the people said again and again, you did that, you placed this leak, you were a traitor, and so on. And I said, I don't know who did that. And until now, it's not known who gave, for instance, the information to the Nouvelle Observateur. Of course, I tried to get the information. I asked the man who wrote the article, but of course he didn't respond to me. So this belongs to these kind of stories also. It's quite yeah. This is part of Heidegger reception in Europe. But yeah, like I said before, the discussion about the Black Notebooks and these passages about the Jews were definitely very influential in the public sphere in Germany. But I don't think that I'm responsible for that. Like people maybe until today think that I'm responsible for this picture of Heidegger in the public sphere, but I don't. I just I don't. Or Judas. I'm more Judas. Yeah, I'm a little bit more than Judas. No. But this is of course interesting in the holy economy. Judas is very important to know. Without Judas, we would have Christianity. So it was really something like if you I belonged to the core of this dogmatic Heidegger. I was friends with François Félier, I was friends with von Hermann, and after that, I was the main enemy. I was the devil, and that was interesting as an experience. Félier said in an interview in a newspaper in Paris that I'm imbecile, so I'm mentally ill actually. So these kind of things happened. These can happen if you really in love with a philosopher. So in this sense, I can understand that because I can feel, I can understand what it means to be in love with a philosopher. But you have to know that actually, if you read Nietzsche, for instance, you have to know that you can have a master, but you should be able to live him at one point. Not to fight against him, no, but to deal with him on another level, not in the relation of love. You know, this is the problem. Is if you are in a love relation with somebody, you have always certain problems coming from this relation itself. So with this person, if you are outside of this relation, suddenly this person is a different person. You can deal with it. But in this relation, you have all the time the same problems, all the time the same struggles and fights. This can be compared with love, relation to a certain philosopher. Yeah, that was about that.
We will discuss the whole thing later. I know that to invite. You have published a lot of phenomenological and hermeneutical studies in which the central place belongs to Heidegger. So, as it's known, Heidegger philosophy had a great resonance in Italy, especially the framework of the philosophical movement Virgilio Cesarone, and which was headed by Gianni Vattimo, but actually nowadays has a little bit lost his influence in Italy. However, there are philosophers, also Emanuele Severino, Adam Ben, Roberto Esposito, Adriano Farnes, to name just a few of them, who in various ways continue Heidegger's project of overpassing the metaphysics. So we published some years ago, selected is in contemporary Italian philosophy, edited by Univerza. Those philosophers are presented also in this issue. So, what is your own view of Heidegger philosophy and the reception of Heidegger in Italy?
Thank you. Then I must read. My English is very bad, but I try to let you understand. First of all, I would like to start with a premise that considers the position from which it appears necessary to measure oneself with the work of a great philosopher like Martin Heidegger. Clearly, the easiest and in a certain sense most reassuring option when dealing with the impressive corpus of writings of Martin Heidegger is to try to get between its folds, in a certain sense guarding the treasure one believes one has found. This is an attitude that could be described as typical of Heideggerian scholasticism or orthodoxy, and which, far be it from me to attempt to denigrate it, must also be appreciated in its primary didactic aims. Okay. I was a scholar of Povod too. But this attitude, i.e. that of taking Heidegger's texts literally in order to try to make them more clear, perhaps paraphrasing them, is also typical of all those, and there are many of them, who reject Heidegger's thought because it is now considered unpresentable due to the blatant admixture with Nazi, and even more so due to the documented anti-Semitic phrases. Compared to these two possibilities, there is a third, which is to try to work philosophically towards Heideggerian texts, thus with a sovereignty that must characterize the critical attitude towards a thinker who aroused interest not because of the frustration of a small bourgeois German nationalist, but because of the great philosophical questions he raised in his works. All of this clearly should not lead us to consider what the black notebooks have brought out to be superfluous, but we must keep our distance and try to understand how we can continue to do philosophy without lapsing into a doxographic exercise for its own sake. An Italian philosopher, Massimo Cacciari, in this regard, once told me that great philosophers are like great rivers. In their flow towards the sea, they carry so many things: pieces of logs, branches, leaves, sewage. No one can ever think of finding in these great rivers transparent and crystalline waters. These, the crystal clear, transparent waters, you can only find in a small mountain streams that are not navigable and in which we cannot even dive, but in which we can only bathe our feet. So, in Italy, there are basically three distinct modes of intervention with regard to the black notebooks anti-Semitism affair, and thus on the possibility or otherwise of continuing to read Heidegger. The first is the one we can trace back to Donatella di Cesare, who, differing from the formulation used by Petra Trawny, does not speak of an anti-Semitism of the history of being, but of a metaphysical anti-Semitism. The metaphysic is anti-Semitic, present in Heidegger, but in the philosophy, to court. This metaphysical anti-Semitism would not just be a brief relapse into the metaphysics of Heidegger, as Gianni Vattimo prefers to assert, but would rather be a real chance for philosophy to think about the Shoah from the history of metaphysics. This is the reason why 2040 was considered by Donatella di Cesare to be year zero for the interpretation of Heidegger's thought. Because from that moment on, the essential link between his thought and the anti-Semitism of philosophy could not be ignored. However, this does not mean shying away from a confrontation with Heidegger's thought, but it does mark its reception in the verbs. The second position, Francesco Alfieri, private assistant of the late Professor von Hermann, who seeks to downplay the anti-Semitic significance of the phrases contained in the black notebooks in the light of a reconsidered link in these pages with the work by Trevians of philosophy. And Leonardo Messinese, for whom an expedient epoche is more interesting. An expedient epoche has to be made with regard to the philosophical text, not only of Heidegger, but of all thinkers. Philosophical thought, so Leonardo Messinese, in its manifestation always exposes itself to misunderstanding. That is the essential factual misunderstanding into which the common mentality inevitably falls. This common mentality discusses everything that philosophy presents to it as if it were something existing, and takes it from the outset on the same level and the things it does in everyday life. It does not consider, nor can it understand, that what philosophy is concerned with only opens up from its transformation in human existence. This transformation of man, which is demanded at every philosophical step, is opposed by the common mentality because of its natural laziness. Only with careful reconstructive acumen would it be possible, therefore, to fully understand certain pages that the common mentality rejects as unacceptable. As also, with epoche, we can understand well the anti-Semitic phrases of Heidegger. But the one that interests me primarily and which I consider most appropriate and even fruitful is a third position, which is linked to a work by Eugenio Mazzarella entitled Il mondo nell'abisso, Heidegger e quaderni neri, the world in the heavens. While it is certainly necessary to condemn and reject the clearly anti-Semitic passages in there
entirety. This cannot and indeed must not lead to the temptation of consigning such an important 20th century author to oblivion, because otherwise one would run the risk of failing to understand a large part of contemporary philosophy, leaving it to be represented exclusively by the hegemony of other models of thought. Beyond this aspect, any critical comparison with Heidegger's philosophy must start from a principle of common sense, whereby to consider that the thought of a philosopher, of Heidegger, even a Greek philosopher like Heidegger, may have played a role from a political or even ideological point of view on the Third Reich. Also, and above all, with regard to the Jews, appears to be a fatal mistake. Clearly, the interest in the political subject that was emerging in the 1930s in Germany was seen, above all, a possible way to overcome the opposition between Anglo-Saxon capitalism and the Soviet dictatorship. This disillusionment. No, after this came a disillusionment, showing how even National Socialism was nothing more than an expression of the mere technical dimension, das Gestell, aimed at making the world an instrument of mere power and the accumulation of financial profit. What instead seems more interesting from an historical and political perspective is the Gnostic turn of Heidegger thought, found in a progressive rejection of history, with an anathema towards the present and its roots. But another way, this position of Heidegger's increasingly took the form of an anti-humanistic posture, which saw in Christianity, i.e. in one of the roots of Europe, the inability to face the truth of the entity in being. In this sense, the anti-Judaism, rather than anti-Semitism, found in the Black Notebooks, has the same root as the aversion to Christianity and Catholicism in particular. They would be profoundly nihilistic because they were responsible for the decline inherent in European civilization. In a way, the gnosis that it created under the surface in pagan time in an existential dimension here takes on the contours of world history. So, Mazzarella's thesis is that Heidegger would have freed himself from his abasement through the Frage nach der Technik, through the question about the technique, which from the 1950s onwards represent a way out on the ontological darkness of the 30s and 40s, restoring Heideggerian thinking to an immersion in history, to its relative elements and its openness to becoming no marked by it. Another productive reading of Heidegger's thought that has taken place in Italy in recent years is that of Roberto Esposito, which finds significant attestation in his latest book entitled Pensiero Istituente, Instituting. Within the problematic framework of the relationship between ontology and politics, Esposito considers three ways of conceiving this relationship, and the first of which can be traced back to Heidegger. For Esposito, Heidegger would be the representative of a paradigm that takes the form of destitute power, even if the term is not contained within the Heideggerian lexicon, It is the hermeneutic measure through which Agamben also thinks of the inoperative character that is inherent in the Gelassenheit of Heideggerian production after the third decade, but especially of the following the 30s. According to Esposito, Heidegger's proposal can be interpreted as the structuring of the impolitic with regard to the political and the destitution that all politics bring with it. In fact, in the years of the Rectorate, we can see a paroxysmal politicization of thought. After the unsuccessful experience of joining Nazism, he abandons any active declaration of politics since it falls within the concept of the realizability of the entity. This is why, according to Esposito, the political leaves more and more space for the impolitic, which should not be thought as an apolitical or anti-political delineation of the real, and therefore not as a negativization of politics, but rather to consider that just as truth as aletheia does not have a possibility of freeing itself from an unfathomable background, in the same way politics is accompanied by a dark, unrepresentable shadow which demonstrates the intrinsic insufficiency of every form of the political. This shadow is the impolitic. This is my resume of the situation.
Thank you very much.